New York City came within a single afternoon of failing to make payroll, of watching its checks bounce like a broke kid's at the corner deli, and the President of the United States was prepared to let it happen. Mayor Abraham Beame stood in his office at City Hall in the fall of 1975 staring down a hole in the budget that no one in his administration could actually make disappear, no matter how creatively they shuffled the paperwork. The mystery this story has to answer isn't just how the richest, biggest city in America ran out of money. It's who let it get that close to the edge, who caught it, and who ended up paying for the fall. Let's be precise about what almost bankrupt meant here, because it's a phrase people throw around loosely. New York City never filed for municipal bankruptcy the way Detroit later would. What it faced in 1975 was something almost as frightening in practical terms, a genuine, imminent default, a moment when the city literally would not have had enough cash on hand to cover checks already written. To municipal workers, to bondholders, to vendors, to hospitals, default would have meant the city's IOUs became worthless overnight, its ability to borrow anywhere in America would have collapsed, and every other city and state watching would have suddenly found Wall Street a lot less friendly too. This wasn't an abstraction, it was a countdown, and by October of 1975 the number of days left was measured in single digits. To understand how it got there, you have to go back further, to the 1960s, when New York built itself into something genuinely unusual among American cities, a place that behaved fiscally and socially, almost like a small European welfare state. Under Mayor Robert Wagner in the late 50s and early 60s, and then dramatically under John Lindsay from 1966 to 1973, the city expanded its municipal payroll, its hospital system, its public university system, and its welfare rolls at a pace no comparable American city matched. The City University of New York had offered free tuition since its founding as the Free Academy in 1847. That's not a Lindsay-era invention, that's over a century of civic tradition, but the broader expansion of public higher education, open admissions starting in 1970, municipal hospitals in nearly every borough, and a welfare caseload that swelled from roughly 328,000 recipients in 1960 to more than 1 million by 1970, all of it cost real money, and the city kept saying yes. Some of that yes came from genuine compassion and civic ambition. Some came from pressure. Organizers like those in the National Welfare Rights Organization pushed hard and successfully for expanded eligibility. Some came from simple political math. Municipal unions had grown powerful, and elected officials found it easier to grant generous contracts and pensions now and worry about funding them later. And later was the problem, because underneath the expanding services, the ground itself was eroding. New York lost something like 600,000 manufacturing jobs between the 1950s and the mid-1970s, garment factories in the West 30s, print shops, waterfront industry along the Brooklyn and Manhattan docks, all of it drifting to the suburbs, the South, or overseas, chasing cheaper labor and cheaper land. The docks that once made Red Hook and the West Side piers roar with longshoremen shrank as container shipping moved to New Jersey. Middle-class families followed the jobs out to Long Island and Westchester and New Jersey, taking their property taxes with them. Between 1970 and 1980, the city's population fell by roughly 800,000 people, from about 7.89 million to 7.07 million, a decline of over 10% in a single decade. So you had a city promising an ever larger menu of services to a population that was shrinking and getting poorer on average, funded by a tax base that was shrinking right along with it. Something had to give, and for a long time, city government's answer was, don't let it give, just borrow. This is where the accounting tricks come in, and they're worth walking through slowly, because they're the actual mechanism of the crisis, not just political color. New York City, like most municipalities, has an operating budget for day-to-day expenses, salaries, supplies, services, and a capital budget for long-term investments like school construction or bridge repair, which is legitimately funded through long-term borrowing because you're building something that will last decades. Starting in the Lindsay years and accelerating under Beame, the city began quietly paying operating expenses, actual teacher salaries, actual daily costs, out of the capital budget, essentially borrowing 30-year money to cover this Tuesday's bills. On top of that, the city was rolling over enormous amounts of short-term debt, revenue anticipation notes, tax anticipation notes, bond anticipation notes, all of it essentially a credit card that got paid off by taking out a new credit card. By 1975, the city had somewhere around $6 billion in short-term notes outstanding, part of a total debt load north of $14 billion, an amount that dwarfed anything comparable American cities were carrying relative to their tax base. Abraham Beame is a genuinely tragic figure in this story, and the irony sits right at the center of his career. Before he became mayor in January 1974, Beame had served as the city's comptroller, the chief financial watchdog, from 1970 to 1973, which meant the man who inherited the fiscal crisis as mayor had, in an earlier job, been one of the officials responsible for the very bookkeeping practices that hid its scale. He was a careful, quiet, unglamorous former accountant, 5'2", a product of the Brooklyn Democratic machine, and by all accounts he genuinely didn't grasp, or didn't want to grasp, how bad things had gotten until the bond market decided it had had enough. That reckoning came in the spring of 1975. The city depended on selling short-term notes to major banks. First National City Bank, which we now call Citibank, under Chairman Walter Wriston, and Chase Manhattan, under David Rockefeller, were among the biggest underwriters to keep the rollover machine running. In April 1975, those banks and the broader municipal bond market simply stopped buying. The city tried to auction notes and found no takers at reasonable interest rates. Adding to the panic, the state's own Urban Development Corporation, a public agency building housing projects, defaulted on its notes in February 1975, a shock that made every investor in New York paper suddenly ask what else might be rotten. Wall Street had looked closely at the city's books for essentially the first time in years, and what the analysts found terrified them: a structural deficit that outside estimates put at roughly $1.5 billion for the fiscal year beginning July 1975. Hidden inside years of borrowed-to-pay borrowing accounting. Once the banks stopped buying, the city had no way to raise the cash it needed to keep functioning day to day. This is the moment the crisis stopped being a paperwork problem and became an emergency. Governor Hugh Carey, who'd taken office in Albany just months earlier in January 1975, understood something Beame perhaps couldn't fully admit. The state, not just the city, had skin in this game, because a New York City default would poison the market for every New York State bond too. In June 1975, Carey pushed the state legislature to create the Municipal Assistance Corporation, nicknamed, inevitably, Big Mac, a new public authority empowered to issue bonds backed not by the city's shaky general credit, but by dedicated streams of city sales tax and stock transfer tax revenue, money that would flow to bondholders before it ever touched the city's discretionary budget. To run it, Carey turned to Felix Rohatyn, a partner at the investment bank Lazard Frères, an immigrant himself. He'd fled Nazi-occupied France as a child, who became the indispensable deal-maker of the entire crisis, shuttling between bankers, union leaders, and politicians for the next several years. But even Mac's first bond offering struggled to find buyers at first. The market's confidence in anything labeled New York had cratered that badly. By September, it was clear Mac alone wasn't going to be enough, and the state took an extraordinary step. The legislature created the Emergency Financial Control Board on September 9, 1975, a body with the governor, the mayor, the state comptroller, the city comptroller, and appointed private citizens, mostly business executives, sitting together with the actual legal power to approve or reject the city's budgets, wage agreements, and financial plans. For all practical purposes, New York City lost control of its own checkbook. Elected officials in City Hall could still propose budgets, but outside overseers, several of them unelected bankers and executives, now had veto power over how the fifth largest city budget on earth would be run. It's worth pausing on how strange that is in a democracy, a city of nearly 8 million people, effectively placed into fiscal receivership by its own state government because the alternative was worse. Even with Mac and the control board in place, the city kept sliding toward the day it wouldn't be able to pay its bills, and Washington was watching with open hostility. President Gerald Ford's Treasury Secretary, William Simon, argued forcefully that a federal bailout would only reward decades of fiscal irresponsibility and invite every mismanaged city in the country to expect the same treatment. Ford himself, addressing the National Press Club on October 29, 1975, delivered a blistering speech ruling out federal aid and accusing the city of having spent itself into a crisis of its own making. The next morning, the Daily News ran the headline that has outlived nearly everything else about this story: Ford to City, Drop Dead. It's one of the most famous headlines in American newspaper history, and it's worth saying plainly, Ford never actually said those three words. The headline was the paper's editors compressing the substance of a hard, punitive speech into something punchier and crueler than his literal remarks. And it stuck to him for the rest of his political life, arguably costing him votes in New York. In the close 1976 election, he'd go on to lose. But even if the phrase was journalistic shorthand, the substance was real. The federal government, as of that week, intended to let America's largest city go down. That refusal set up the single most dangerous stretch of the entire crisis, the days right around October 17, 1975, arguably the specific day this whole story is named for. The city owed $453 million in obligations due that day, including debt payments to bondholders, and there was, by that morning, no clear source of cash to cover it. Rohatyn and Carey worked the phones desperately. The last possible source of rescue turned out to be the municipal employee pension funds themselves, and specifically the teachers' retirement system, controlled in large part by the United Federation of Teachers under its president, Albert Shanker. Shanker was being asked to commit roughly $150 million of teachers' retirement savings to buy MAC bonds that, if the city defaulted anyway, would be worth approximately nothing, meaning the plan asked working teachers to risk their own pensions to save the city that employed them. Shanker, after brutal high-pressure negotiations that stretched into the actual deadline hours, agreed, partly persuaded that a city default would wreck the pension fund's other holdings anyway, and partly under enormous pressure from Rohatyn, Carey, and fellow Labour leader Victor Gottbaum of District Council 37, who represented tens of thousands of the city's municipal workers and understood exactly what a default would mean for every one of them. The check cleared. New York didn't default that day. It's a strange thing to sit with. The city's solvency, for one crucial afternoon, rested on the retirement savings of its public school teachers, gambled by their union president under duress, with almost no time to spare. That near miss didn't end the crisis, but it changed the political weather, because it demonstrated just how close to the abyss things actually stood, and that seemed to finally move Washington. In December 1975, Congress passed the New York City Seasonal Financing Act, and Ford, despite his October rhetoric, signed it on December 9, 1975. It authorized the Treasury to lend the city up to $2.3 billion a year through 1978. Seasonal loans meant to smooth out cash flow gaps within each fiscal year, at market interest rates, all of it required to be repaid before the year was out. It wasn't a bailout in the sense of free money. It was closer to an emergency line of credit with real interest attached, and in the end the city repaid every dollar, on time or early, and the federal government collected something like $40 million in interest for its trouble. That fact became an important talking point for defenders of the rescue in later years. Washington didn't give New York a gift. It made a profit lending to a city that, once forced into discipline, honored every payment. So the central mystery is answered here. The city was caught not by one hero, but by a chain of reluctant actors. State officials who built emergency authorities, a deal maker who kept the pieces from flying apart, a union leader who staked his members' pensions, and finally a federal government that grudgingly extended credit only once it was clear the alternative was national financial contagion. But forced into discipline is exactly the phrase, because the discipline was brutal on the ground, and it fell overwhelmingly on people who hadn't caused the crisis and had the least cushion to absorb it. Between 1975 and the trough of the layoffs, the city's workforce shrank by tens of thousands of positions. Figures cited at the time put the total reduction from the 1975 peak at somewhere around 60 to 70,000 jobs across agencies over the following years. The police department alone laid off roughly 5,000 officers in 1975. Firefighters, sanitation workers, hospital staff, teachers, nearly every uniformed and civilian city service absorbed deep cuts. On July 1, 1975, laid-off police officers and firefighters, furious and frightened, staged a chaotic protest that spilled onto the Brooklyn Bridge, blocking traffic, smashing at least one police car, in scenes that made national news and did nothing for the city's reputation. Later that same year, unions representing police and firefighters distributed a grim pamphlet at airports and tourist entry points to the city called Welcome to Fear City. Its cover decorated with a skull, warning visitors to stay indoors after 6 p.m., avoid public transportation, and generally treat New York like a war zone, a piece of self-inflicted psychological warfare aimed squarely at tourism dollars, meant to pressure the city into reversing the very layoffs its authors had suffered. The cuts reached into places most New Yorkers had assumed were permanent fixtures of civic life. In 1976, the City University of New York ended its free tuition policy for the first time since its 1847 founding, a change that fell hardest on working-class and immigrant students in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens, who had used CUNY as the great engine of upward mobility for generations, Jewish immigrants earlier in the century, and by the 70s increasingly black Puerto Rican and other immigrant New Yorkers relying on that same open door. Municipal hospitals closed wards or entire facilities. Fire companies were closed or put on rotating brownout schedules, particularly hitting poorer neighborhoods in the South Bronx and central Brooklyn that could least afford slower response times. The subway system, already aging, saw capital maintenance deferred for years. Part of the reason the 1970s and early 1980s became the era New Yorkers now remember through graffiti-covered cars, mechanical breakdowns, and a general sense that the system was quietly falling apart, a decline that wouldn't be seriously reversed until new leadership at the Metropolitan Transportation Authority pushed through major capital investment in the following decade. Nowhere did the human cost concentrate more visibly than the South Bronx, where disinvestment redlining by banks and insurers and a wave of arson, some of it landlords burning their own buildings for insurance payouts, once rent control and rising costs made the buildings worth more dead than occupied, combined with city budget cuts to hollow out entire blocks. Streets like Charlotte Street became a kind of national shorthand for urban collapse. When President Jimmy Carter visited that very block in October 1977, walking through rubble-strewn lots surrounded by burned-out buildings, the photographs ran in newspapers across the country and cemented an image of New York as a city that had simply given up on some of its own neighborhoods. It didn't help that in early 1976, Roger Starr, the city's housing administrator, floated a controversial concept he called planned shrinkage, suggesting the city should deliberately withdraw services from the most depopulated, decaying blocks and concentrate resources elsewhere. An idea that, whether or not it was ever formally implemented as policy, confirmed to residents of the Bronx and Brownsville and Bushwick exactly how city government regarded them at the time, as populations to be managed downward rather than communities to be rebuilt. That climate of neglect and desperation curdled into open disorder on the night of July 13th and 14th, 1977, when a massive lightning-triggered blackout knocked out power across most of the city. Unlike the largely orderly 1965 blackout, this one produced widespread looting and arson, concentrated heavily in already struggling neighborhoods, Bushwick in Brooklyn, parts of the South Bronx, sections of Harlem, where over 1,600 stores were damaged or looted and more than 1,000 fires were set within about 24 hours, leading to over 3,700 arrests, at the time the largest mass arrest in the city's history. It would be too simple to say the fiscal crisis directly caused the blackout riots, but it's impossible to separate the desperation and the sense of official abandonment that had built up over 2 years of layoffs, closed firehouses, and vanished city services from the fury that boiled over that July night. And yet this is the part that surprises people culturally. This exact period of decay produced some of the most influential art New York City has ever generated. Cheap rents in a collapsing East Village and Lower East Side let CBGB, the club at 315 Bowery, become the incubator for punk and new wave acts like the Ramones, Television and Talking Heads starting around 1974 and 1975. In the same South Bronx that Roger Starr and Jimmy Carter both surveyed as a symbol of ruin, DJs like Kool Herc were, in these very years, building the foundational sounds and block party culture that would become hip-hop. Disaster and creative explosion were happening on the same blocks, sometimes in the same buildings, and that contradiction says something true and uncomfortable about how cities actually work. Collapse for some people in some neighborhoods becomes raw material for others. Predicted CTA Sentence 01. Politically, the crisis ended Abraham Beam's career. Running for re-election in 1977 weighed down by the layoffs, the blackout, and the general perception that he'd been either dishonest or clueless about the scale of the problem while he was comptroller. Beam lost the Democratic primary badly, finishing behind Ed Koch, Mario Cuomo, and others, and Koch went on to become mayor in January 1978. Koch inherited the same control board oversight and the same austerity mandates, but he made a public performance of fiscal discipline that helped restore market confidence, and gradually, painstakingly, the city clawed its way back towards solvency through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. The Emergency Financial Control Board's direct veto powers over the budget technically lapsed when the city regained the ability to sell its own long-term bonds again on the open market in 1981, and the formal control period ended in 1986, though the board itself, renamed over the years, remained on the books as a standby mechanism that could theoretically be reactivated if the city ever slid back toward crisis, a kind of permanent reminder hanging over City Hall of exactly how much sovereignty a municipal government can lose when it loses the market's trust. The deeper legacy runs through the plumbing of how the city has been governed ever since. The Financial Emergency Act of 1975 forced New York to adopt rolling 4-year financial plans, generally accepted accounting principles instead of the creative bookkeeping that had hidden the deficit for years, and far more rigorous, transparent budgeting than any mayor before Beam had ever been required to produce. In a very real sense, every New York City budget since the late 1970s has been built inside guardrails installed during those terrifying months in 1975. Guardrails put there not by voters or elected reformers, but by bond lawyers, bankers, and a state control board that briefly ran the city like a company emerging from receivership. So who really governs a city when the money runs out? The people who were elected or the people who hold the debt? So here's the uncomfortable truth this whole story leaves you with. The city that likes to think of itself as the capital of the world, the city of Wall Street and the United Nations and more billionaires than anywhere on earth, spent the fall of 1975 unable to guarantee its own teachers would get paid, and it survived only because those same teachers, under duress, gambled their retirements on the bet that the city they served would somehow pull through. It's worth remembering, every time you swipe a MetroCard on a rebuilt platform or walk past a restored block in the South Bronx, that the balance of power between elected New Yorkers and the financial institutions that lend the city money was drawn, in large part during those few desperate weeks when the whole apparatus nearly stopped.